Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to OpEd.tv. We're barely into Trump's second term as president, and already the chaos and incompetence and outright malevolence are enough to overwhelm us. The risk to our democracy is real, and it is dire. The risk to our economy is just as dire. Tens of thousands of federal employees are being fired willy-nilly on nothing more than the whim of Donald Trump and his co-destructionist, Elon Musk. I could go on. But what can we do about all of this? Where is the resistance? How can ordinary Americans fight back? I'll talk about that with my very special guest, Katrina vanden Heuvel, the extraordinary longtime publisher of The Nation magazine. Welcome, Katrina.
Thank you, Bob.
And I can't even tell you how happy I am to see you. It's been a long time since we've seen each other. We'll start with you telling us the 2 or 3 things that you're most concerned about what's going on now.
I begin with the fact that Donald Trump's more disciplined second term is framed by the Project 2025, which people should go out, preferably not buy, but find it free and absorb its lessons, because it's about dismantling the administrative state, which sounds very cold and sterile, but that means cutting the civilizing advances of our time, whether it's Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. It's about the courts, and it's about maintaining the courts as a right-wing ideological instrument. It's about the media and making sure that those elements of the media which have regulatory business in Washington understand that and are fearful of Washington. And it's about fear. I think that the fear many people feel is something out of control, as you described, the whiplash, the backlash. It's 50 days, I believe. You know, at The Nation, we were in old-fashioned mode before the election.
Right.
100 days. That's the traditional measurement of a president's administration. So the speed and the chaos I worry about as well, because I think people have a hard time absorbing. At the same time, even though people say that the Resistance 1.0 in 2017 didn't really play a role, I think the Women's March was very important. I think the travel ban protests at airports, it's different this time. So we can talk about that. It's, I would say, Resistance 2.0. There's an awareness of how difficult these times are because all power is concentrated, at least federally and in the courts, among MAGA forces. Mm-hmm. I hate to use that term because I think they're making America insecure, weak, and it's a destructive force that is afflicting us, not a building.
I think it is a really destructive force. I agree. I'm hoping that the MAGA term just becomes a horrible term that people associate it with the destruction that's going on right now, and I think it may come to that.
But Bob, I think looking back, not that far back, but this was a change election. People were seeking change, and I think it was incumbent upon the Democrats to play that forward, and Trump played that well. But disruption and change come together, as well as advancing great reforms. We were just talking about the Consumer Protection Financial Board.
Right.
Only new agency in 50, 60 years that is there designed to help people, consumers. Look what they've done in the last 2 weeks.
And it was such an important agency. I mean, if people forget that this came right after the Great Recession.
That's right. And so the Great Recession, what we're witnessing really in some ways is a cycle of, we've had the Great Recession, we've had financial crises, we've had an establishment that hasn't been held accountable. Right. And that includes a Democratic establishment for the kind of disruption, I would call it, in many, many parts of this country due to bad trade, I'd say trade policies which didn't favor workers, favored an elite. But what we're witnessing...
I remember, excuse me, I remember getting in trouble when I was at the Times. I hadn't been at the Times that long, and I was critical of NAFTA. Because it didn't have protection for workers, and it didn't have protection for the environment, you know, and I was very specific about it. And I remember people saying, he just doesn't understand the economy, he doesn't understand economics. It's like, oh my goodness. What I understood was that aspects of that trade agreement were going to hurt working people.
And I do think one can say MAGA, one can say Trump is a liar, which he is.
Which he is.
But then you have to turn and look at what did produce this backlash in our country, and to a large extent it was trade, and it was in states which Democrats didn't play well in or didn't really campaign in. we've learned, I think. I mean, but I do think trade policies, and look what happened to you. The establishment basically quashed
Yep.
any criticism at high levels. And I think that showed to workers, like, which side are, the Democratic Party, in my mind, there's a Democratic wing of the Democratic Party. And Howard Dean said that when he ran for a state.
I remember, right.
But you know who really began that? Is Paul Wellstone.
Oh, I remember Paul Wellstone. He
Wellstone.
was so wonderful. Oh my, I
I
can't
know.
believe you mentioned Paul Wellstone because people have forgotten about him.
I hate to say the nation runs a cruise. Where we have a lot of people, we had more people from Idaho than New York City this past cruise. People want to be engaged and know what to do. But at that time, the connectivity on the cruise was bad, and I got off the 26 voicemails from people who were just torn up. 'Cause
Devastated.
So he talked about the Democratic wing of the Democratic
Yeah.
Party, or the left wing of the possible. And I think that there is within the Democratic Party that element. It's just we're poor. We have two main parties, but they're coalitions within the Democratic Party.
Right.
So,
Well, one of the things that has happened with the parties is, and you basically talk about Democrats forgetting people who have been supportive of Democrats for so many decades,
Right.
for example. But one of the things that happened was you start watching television, and I remember when the red and blue things started to come out. And then after a while, it became etched in stone.
Absolutely.
And then it became, well, these states are going to be Republicans, these states are going to be Democratic. It's only these small handful of states that are going to decide the election, and it's almost like it's no longer a national election. It's horrifying. It was
it's horrifying
to
then,
me.
but it's so glad you brought that up because I remember vividly it was after Bush won, I think the first time.
Yeah,
And it was
right.
about NASCAR. And I've been to Mooresville, North Carolina, with not Dale, or it was the NASCAR star who has a Graceland home there. But it was like if you didn't know who he was, you were like consigned to Bluedom forever.
Isn't that something?
But now we see the polarization in a different way. My best friend moved to Idaho. Her husband's there. You have the largest wilderness park, the Frank Church, River of No Return.
You're coming
A
up
lot
with
of
all
people.
these names.
But
You're
this is where the
scaring me.
populist, Fred Harris, Oklahoma,
Yep.
a church in Idaho, Fulbright, again, Arkansas. And I think what you see with Bernie Sanders, who's 83, traveling around the country to Iowa City, to Wisconsin, to small towns, as he has the last 2 weeks, bringing people with him, not just, he had 6,000 people.
I was just going to say, crowds turning out to
showing
see
people
Bernie.
are seeking to hear
Yep.
something that's not on scale in so many communities. But I think people are waking up. There was a story yesterday about how Democrats are going to yak about sports to get in touch
Oh,
with
I
the ordinary.
saw that.
Now, I will say I'm the first
The
nation
bros.
editor to hire a sports writer. Dave Zirin, I think his father.
I've had Dave Zirin on this show more than once. Dave is fantastic.
He's amazing.
Yeah.
But someone once said you want people to come to political radio as they come to sports radio, filled with stats and I do think one of the silver linings, it's not that silver, but people now know what filibuster. A lot of people know filibuster, electoral college, the
Yep.
details, and that moves people to be more engaged. In some ways, it's hard. I mean, the first week, people were just getting their bearings.
I know. But a lot of the people that you mentioned who were in the Democratic wing of the Democratic Party were from states now where Democrats can't get elected. You know, and I remember when Paul Wellstone.
He was in Minnesota. Yeah, Minnesota remains an interesting.
Yeah, no, Minnesota. Yeah, you
Yeah.
can still have a Democrat elected from Minnesota, but Wellstone, besides being so sharp politically, I mean, I just think that he was fantastic. He was just like a wonderful person. He was and he used to call up. I was at the Times at the time, and he would just call up. Hey, Bob, how are you? Do you have a
know.
few minutes? I was like,
There are very few who do that now. I mean, the great sociologist Frances Fox Piven, she said he used to call her once or twice a month. This doesn't happen. But right now within the Congress, and I personally feel you need both social movements on the ground and people in
Right.
power to make change. But you do have a progressive caucus, which is 100 strong, maybe it's really 50. But, I say to the nation when people rail against Democrats, okay, but you're self-marginalizing in a way if you don't accept that there are people in Congress who write for us. Pramila Jayapal Jamie Raskin has been writing for us for 30 years. So you got to reckon with that.
And there are also people, because to some extent, I have mixed feelings about this. One, I often think the Democrats don't fight hard enough. You know, they're not loud enough.
Yep.
On the other hand, there are things, especially if you're talking about legislators, if you're talking about people in Congress, they have important jobs to do, which take a lot of work. And we are getting this blizzard of legislation and budgets and
Yes.
all this other stuff from the Trump people.
Yeah.
People have to decide, well, what are we going to fight in the courts? What kind of strategy can we develop maybe to stop this legislation or to pare it down so that it's not as bad as it's going to be? You know, what's going to happen with tax policy? So maybe those are not the people who should be out there on television every night or whatever, but they have an important job to play.
They have a very important job, and I think it's hard to convey to people that there is an element of transactional as well as transformational
course. Yep.
politics.
Yep.
And the transactional could lead to transformational, but you have to accept it. They're protecting Social Security. I mean, they're doing things that are defensive. And right now, what's stunning on election night was the House going, because
Right.
all
and the way it went.
I know. The House, I think in 2026, that's the strategy, so to speak, short term,
Right.
to take back the
Yes.
House.
Which would be so important.
You could hold hearings. You could do a set of
Exactly.
many things, which you cannot do now. And then, of course,
And you can stop legislation.
You can stop.
Stop the worst legislation, yep.
and those are important steps. And then outside, you know, indivisibles come back, which people should look up because it is in many communities. States become more important. I mean, we've been covering Secretary of State races for years, right? But attorney generals, governors, state legislative. Michigan is no longer a Democratic state legislature, but it was. And you can, Minnesota.
But that's one of the things the Republicans did for
Did,
so many
I know.
years when they were out of power. How many times have we seen that the Republican Party is dead? Maybe not.
No, and it's true. And then it comes back well organized. We had an interesting article which compared Reagan's Heritage Foundation mandate for leadership. Remember, he had a whole,
Yep.
and Kim Phillips Fine, a really terrific historian, noted how mild it was compared
that
to the
something?
2025 document, which had its same impetus in think tanks and right-wing think tanks
Yep.
coming together.
Yep.
What do we want? And don't forget, Trump was not trusted in 2016. He had to give the Supreme Court judges list
Yep.
to Pence before the party said, okay, we can do business with him.
So much has changed.
But the looting of the country, that's, you see it, Elon Musk may be a funny character or not, but the crypto stuff, there's going to be an attempt to do to Social Security what privatization was intended to do years ago. They're trying to put crypto in the, you know, Federal Reserve. Who's making off with that? You know?
It's so preposterous, and they just lied. I mean, they go to their constituents and they just lie. They say up is down, you know, and left is
But the
left,
tariff
left
stuff,
is right.
look at the polls. I mean, you can't, I don't bank on polls, but it shows a trend.
But now, when you start talking about the favorability ratings
It's
of
intense.
Trump, Musk, the Republicans in Congress,
That's right.
the fellows that are going to their town halls and
are
aren't even
scared
allowed
to go now. Have scurried away
Right.
because they don't want to be held
So I am
accountable.
paying attention to those approval
Right.
ratings, you know, so I think
No,
that's
I think
significant.
that's right. I will say, though, that the media piece is going to be really important. Part of the problem right now is you see vividly the corporate structure of many media outlets. There are all kinds of media now, which is, I think, is important, nonprofit, community, but the big ones, which are laying off a lot of people, newspapers, broadcast,
Yep.
they have business in Washington. They have regulatory business. We did First Nation Centerfold, Glossy, in 1996, the national entertainment state showed 4 octopi, GEE, ABC Disney, and news was a little part
Yep.
because they own so much, and I think you see that. And you also see they're trying to delegitimize the media.
And talk a little bit about what's going on at the Washington Post.
Well, that's Mr. Bezos, and he has a lot of business before the administration.
Who had promised when he bought it,
That he
purchased
wouldn't
it.
mess. And I wrote a column there for 7 years.
I mean, I remember,
Mostly,
of course.
and I was never messed with. I mean, even when Bezos was owner, I wrote about Amazon, I wrote about strikes, but he had not, Trump wasn't around. You know, it was a different time. You saw what I think is so dangerous, which is sometimes called anticipatory kneeling. You know?
Yes, exactly.
Because they anticipate and they want to make sure they're not caught in the crosshair of litigation. But there are other new laws, Bob. I mean, you know the famous New York Times versus Sullivan, which
Sullivan,
is
yeah, I know. They
upheld.
want to revisit that.
They sued the paper in Iowa, which had the
Yep.
the pollster, and they're going to use all kinds of newfangled. And then she resigned because she'd done it for a long time. But that's scary because I think there are courageous people. It opens the door for new kinds of media, which are forming. But they
And
don't
it
have
has this chilling effect, so other people don't want to take a chance.
That's
They
right.
worry about losing their job. They worry about being
can't fault
publicly
them.
attacked. No, you can't.
I don't sit in judgment of people who need their jobs.
Somebody's
or-
got a family. They've got a couple of kids in college. They've got a house with a mortgage and that sort of thing. And because you say one wrong thing, you might lose your
I
livelihood.
know. Right now, we're also facing a challenge to institutions. I personally think we need to build an apprenticeship system in this country so you don't have on election night uneducated versus educated, which doesn't help with dignity and respect. But it is the case that right now, the universities, we see with Columbia,
Yeah.
attempt to defund by $400 million.
Yep.
And what's happening now, I think, these are the elite schools. Harvard is laying off people and freezing salaries. The attempt to muzzle higher education is a proxy, in a way, for attempting to chill and freedom of speech issues, which, you know, remember Dukakis, I'm a card-carrying member of, didn't he say of the ACLU? The ACLU has played great roles, but civil liberties has not been the most popular issue
Right.
in this country.
Right.
It's often a minority issue, but one which needs to be supported, especially in these kinds of times.
So talk a little bit about, I'm not sure what to call it, the resistance. Have you seen efforts? There are efforts underway, and in fact, you mentioned Bernie Sanders.
Bernie Sanders.
And Chris Murphy from Connecticut is doing a terrific job too. But talk a little bit about people who are outside of Congress, who are participating. I'm not necessarily leading in resistance. What are the kind of things that
Well,
you're
the
seeing?
scientists, you know,
Oh, my
scientists
goodness.
this past weekend had marches, protests in Washington, across the country. My colleague is in Madison, but he travels to Altoona and Kenosha. There were scientists and there were ordinary people seeing Bernie, but the science march was in Washington. And then Indivisible again has all these communities.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, you're seeing student-led protests on campus, often around the muzzling of Palestinian
Yeah.
voices
Mm-hmm.
or courses. And then you have the regional, like the local community paper in some instances. Like, I'm not kidding, the West Side Rag. No, Scott Stringer said to us, he running for mayor of New York City, came to the Nation, we've asked all the candidates, and he said, boy, would I like to be endorsed by the West. And by the way, the New York Times, as you know, has stopped endorsing state candidates, local
I
candidates,
saw that.
which I think is an abdication
I'm
of its
appalled
role.
by it.
It's always been contested, you know, how much it covers New York, and it's cut back. There are other sources. There are 3 nonprofit papers now, City, New York Focus. But I think it's a role that New York Times has played effectively. That it.
I thought it was so important because, especially on local races, and I remember I would be running around and writing columns here and there and everywhere, but I would talk to people all the time, and I'm sure you did too. They wanted to know where the Times came down on this stuff, and very often these are candidates who don't get a lot of attention, so the
Right.
voters don't really know much about them.
So
And
it's a
they-
civic
and they
duty in a
rely
way.
they rely on the Times. They
Yep.
relied on the Times. So
I don't know.
I
I don't
think
know
it
where
is
that
kind
came
of
from.
an abdication.
Well, but then you had the abdication of endorsement period by the Washington Post, by the LA Times. You know, I thought that was pretty. It was an example of, again, they were fearful of saying something that would enable Trump or Musk to shut them down or chill. But the chill effect is something. I mean, I've been at the Nation for many, many years. A lot of work I did in school was on the McCarthy period, which people might look up. It's not Eugene McCarthy,
I
it's
was
Joe
just going to
McCarthy.
say, people now don't really know about the McCarthy
I know,
period.
and it was a
and
very-
they don't understand the nuances of that period.
Yeah.
It was so profound.
And it wasn't just Joe McCarthy or Washington,
No,
D.C.
not at
It
all.
was-
Absolutely not.
I did a story on a teacher.
Joe McCarthy was in the Senate. I mean,
That's right.
a lot of the terrible stuff came right out of the House with UAC.
That's right. And there was Red Channels.
Yeah, Red Channels.
Red
Oh my
Channels was a
goodness,
book designed
where
to-
people were blacklisted
Yes.
in Red Channels.
I mean, I did a paper on a man named George Sokolsky, who was a Hearst columnist, whose main role was clearing people at a certain time. He would interview them and say they've repented, so they're no longer in bad odor, they can get a job. It was an apparatus. I did a piece on a teacher in Fairmont, West Virginia, who was boycotted by the American Legion and the
Yeah.
Rotary. So there are instincts in any country, but especially under stress, under nationalist fever, in a militarized situation world, I think it becomes, and I do think people in this country are not about endless war. There were polls in 3 states in 2016, Ohio, Michigan, and Wisconsin, which showed that endless war was an issue because so many young guys had been sent for multiple deployments
Yeah, I know.
to Iraq, to
I
Afghanistan.
I wrote
They
about that because I was in the military. I was in the
That's
Army
right.
in the 1960s during Vietnam. And
Right.
I was not sent to Vietnam. I spent 14 months in Korea. Didn't have to go to Vietnam, so I was lucky.
But,
But the thing was, it was a hardship tour. Both Vietnam and
Yes,
Korea was a
yeah.
hardship tour. And they tried not to send you back. There were people who did multiple deployments to Vietnam, but they tried to send you just one time. Then we started having these 21st century wars where people were just sent again and again and again. It was like playing Russian roulette.
and
It's
families are left
horrifying.
alone. The Syrian experiences of veterans, which are not attended to. By the way, the veterans will be an important community.
Who are being thrown out
Deprived
of
and
jobs
thrown
in not just in the military, they're being thrown out of government jobs. These folks, men and women who served in the military, some who have served in combat,
And they're
are
still-
now still working for the federal government. They're in public service. And then someone like Musk or Trump comes
Who-
along, whoosh, and you're
You
just
have to wonder
thrown out on the
how-
street.
The other piece, which I think is important, is that public servants like park rangers. I mean, I'm so sick of being labeled, you know, the Chablis drinking, because you're looking at
Right.
people, science people, you know, people from NIH losing their
Yep.
jobs, or park rangers, forest rangers.
Forest rangers are so important, and more important by the year as climate change is on us, and there's,
But I believe that there is a sort of thread about blaming the people. I think that's a politics that's kind of dead on arrival. I think we need to explore what's happening, not just to this country, but the resurgence of right-wing populism or right-wing forces is global.
do you think we've only got a couple of minutes
Yeah.
left? But one of the things, and it's still early in Trump's second term.
It's hard to believe.
It's hard to believe.
But I think you need a program on meditation skills, strengthening wellness in
No
the Trump
kidding.
time.
Oh my goodness. But I've been surprised. You mentioned the Women's March in
Yes.
the first Trump administration. And I have been surprised that more people are not in the street. And both in my life and as a student of history, I mean, I remember the labor movement,
Right.
which was underway. That's one of the few
Yeah.
things underway before I was born, I feel like, But there was the labor movement, the civil rights
Right.
movement, the women's movement, the gay rights movement, the anti-war movement during Vietnam and that sort of thing. Are you surprised that we haven't seen more in terms of protests and demonstrations of that kind?
I'm not.
You're not?
I think people are being more strategic about protest and finding other ways. It doesn't need to be a mass protest. It can be a concentrated protest. It can be a day of protest. It can be a community, park rangers or scientists.
The protests that you've talked about,
Right.
the more targeted protests, and the scientists is
Yeah,
a really important
important
one,
one.
but the park rangers
Yeah.
and everybody. I wish the press or media writ large was giving more coverage to that sort of thing. The public, much of the public doesn't even know about that, and they need to know about it. So,
To their credit, the Times and the Washington Post both covered the
Yeah.
Science March.
Yeah.
But I sat for 3 hours last weekend with Mud Pile. So, but anyway.
I want to see it on television.
If you don't, and also, how is reality defined in our country in many places? By the media.
Of course.
What we see, what we don't see.
Yep.
So I agree with you that there's a role for the media, not
Yep.
to be rosy, but to show some hope and resilience.
All right, so I get hope just talking to you, Katrina. Katrina vanden Heuvel, the Nation magazine, thank you so much
you.
for coming in. I really appreciate
Thank
it.
you so much.
Thank you for watching. I'm Bob Herbert, and we'll see you next time. CUNY TV now has an app. Downloading the CUNY TV app lets you join us anytime from anywhere.